As you know, I've been doing a lot of videos about escape velocity, which is one of my favorite 1990s games, which originally was Mac only. This is the website for escape velocity, essentially, on Ambrosia Software. And they point out that the last Mac operating system that it will run on is OS 9. It's not actually OS 10 compatible, and as such, making a direct port to Windows or Linux is sort of impractical. Although one of the sequels to it, namely Escape Velocity Nova, has been offered as an Escape Velocity port with completely different data files but the same engine. I've reviewed that elsewhere on YouTube. But in the same year that Escape Velocity was released, there was a very, very similar game released called Ares, which Ambrosia also released, although a few years later, even though the original software company, Bigger Planet, had released it earlier. Although it has a very similar feel to Escape Velocity, the plot is somewhat different in that you're basically freeing Earth from an alien occupation, so in that sense it's more of a traditional sci-fi game. But it is pretty deep. And the original version of Ares, released by Ambrosia anyway, is also Mac OS 9 only. And that meant that over the years the user base shrank. And it wasn't clear where the game was going to go. So Nathan Lamont, who was the designer of the game, whose company was in fact Bigger Planet, he was the founder of Bigger Planet in 1994, decided to release the source code so that people could do open source ports. So if we jump over here, this is the Bigger Planet website for Ares. And they say that they published it originally through Changing Software, so that didn't work out. So that's how they ended up with the Ambrosia Software deal in 1999, so the game was already kind of old at that point. And then he released the original, Nathan Lamont released the original source code in 2008. And basically, a number of different developers picked up the project to try and build a port. So he endorses Xsera, right below Antares there, more on that in a bit, but he says it seeks to build upon the original experience rather than reproduce it. So we'll take a look at Xsera here. And we have a 404. And this was the experience I had in researching this project. Unfortunately, like a lot of these projects, the money isn't there, and as such, the motive is not always there to push it very hard. And here he has the Ares source code if you want to do your own port. But there was another project that tried to reproduce Ares called Antares, right here. And it's a very basic website, and they have some screenshots showing you that it works, which is nice. You could watch that trailer on your own, I guess. But they give you a port for Mac OS 10.7, if you want it, right here. See? I'm not going to download it because I don't have a working OS 10 Mac at the moment. And then they have the source code, which I've gone through somewhat. I'll show you that later. But the point is that it's a little bit confusing, and the way they recommend building it does not really involve the use of an integrated development environment. It involves simply using programs that you download specifically on their instructions, such as Ninja. I asked them about developing a port for Windows, and they said that basically the code would have to be rewritten for Windows, and they're not even sure how to do that exactly. I offered to do it for them, actually, but when I talked to Chris Pickle, who is one of the main developers of Antares, he unfortunately didn't have any advice on that. because he was still researching it himself. Part of the problem is that the code is fragmented into many different code files that have to be put together, assembled before you can actually compile the program. So this is just an easier option. Now the drawback to these instructions here is that they don't seem to work on any of the current Linux builds, including the one that he tested on, which was something that was overlooked when these instructions were written, probably before his most recent build. I'm not criticizing him at all. He was actually very helpful in getting me to do a build of my own. Without his help making my own build, I wouldn't have been able to do it. And that brings me to the subject of this video, which is based on his instructions and based on my own experimentation. I'm going to do a tutorial about how to build Ares, or Antares, for Linux on Ubuntu 16. So before you can do this, you will need a working install of Ubuntu 16.04. And Ubuntu 16.04 is available from the Ubuntu website, even though it's not the current build anymore. The reason I'm using 16 is because it was what Chris Pickle used. And I'm going to use a virtual machine, which you may want to as well if you're not an Ubuntu user. But theoretically, this will work with either a virtual machine or a real machine. Probably a virtual machine is more careful. And hopefully by the end of this, we'll have a working port of Ares. Okay, here we are in Ubuntu. There are actually two ways to build Antares, theoretically, for Linux. One is to use a program called curl, C-U-R-L, and that's what I tried initially, but I ran into some bugs and I contacted Chris Pickle about that, and he encouraged me to try their GitHub source for the code, which also involves a different compilation procedure. And we worked on debugging that for couple of days because there were some more surmountable problems that I encountered with that, and so he was very helpful in both ironing out the small problems with it and giving me all the support that I needed to figure out how to do this. So some thanks are certainly due to him as before. Now, as with many things with Linux, you do this from the terminal. So I'll call up the terminal here. So first of all, it says to run a command as administrator, user root, use sudo plus a command, and see man sudo root for details. Manual, that means, of course. And in fact, we're going to have to do that because almost anything in Linux, they just presume you're a hacker. So you have to prove that you're not a hacker by putting in your administrator password to do pretty much anything. So a lot of the instructions you find online for Linux command line operations omit that point, and it's absolutely essential. And sometimes you don't get the error message that you need to tell you, hey, you need to use sudo. So I'm telling you now, all of these commands will use sudo and your administrator password. So you need administrator privileges on whatever account you're installing on. Now, so in the next part, we will install the initial dependencies and download the source code. And then we'll have a lot more work to do actually before this is done. So see you in the next video.